Hi, everyone. My name is Jim McCafferty. I'm an Associate Professor of Criminal Justice at Kennesaw State University. Welcome to the 1 p.m. panel for CrimCon 2020. This is Cross-National Perspective on Crime and Crime Prevention Part 2. We have three really great presentations lined up for you. If you have any questions, we're going to hold questions off to the very end of the panel. But if you have any questions, go ahead and type it in the Q&A box. It should be at the lower portion of your screen. And I'll be kind of getting all the questions, and if we have time, which we should at the end of this panel, I'll go ahead and ask the panelists some of those questions that the attendees have for them. So without further ado, I'm going to throw it to Dara and Natalie, and we'll start the panel. Thank you. Dara, I think you're on mute, man.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, we can hear you now.
Okay. Well, hello, everyone. My name is Dara, and I'm a master's student at the University of Windsor. And thank you for attending our presentation. I also want to thank the organizers for putting together such a nice conference, given the circumstances we live in today. And I'd also want to thank my supervisor, Dr. Natalie Delia Deckard, who would also be accompanying me on this presentation, and she will speak in the latter half of the presentation. So to start off today, we're going to be talking about a research regarding multi-ethnic Canadians and how they are innocent by embodied assimilation. So what we mean by that, to get to that first, I want to talk about what Canadians are and how Canadians are defined. So basically, the Canadian population is characterized by its ethnic heterogeneity. So this basically means that historically, Canadians have been classified as belonging into one of two broad categories, and that consists of people who either identify as being British in origin, or those who are identify as being French in origin. So I must say that such simplistic characterization of what being Canadian is today is incredibly short-sighted, because they do not account for the other forms of diversity Canada has, such as our Indigenous populations, other racialized groups, and immigrants. The Canadian government sometimes refers to these people as the third force. And it must be noted that all these people groups are equal contributors to Canada's national identity and demographic composition. Briefly talking about Indigenous and racialized Canadians, it is well documented that at the hands of the state, of the Canadian government, Indigenous and racialized Canadians have experienced significant forms of discrimination. So the RCMP and the police in Canada historically possessed a significant amount of leverage over Indigenous communities because of how centrally organized that system of governance was, and of colonial imposition. Police in Canada were complicit in the forcible removal of Indigenous children from their families to residential schools in an effort to assimilate them into whatever the colonists thought was appropriate. And at the hands of the police, Indigenous groups presently are victims of the excessive use of force by police. When it comes to other racialized groups, such as Black Canadians, it has been well documented that Black respondents report feeling more vulnerable to police stops and being victims of excessive and multiple encounters with the police in relatively short periods of time. And like Indigenous populations and some other racialized groups in Canada, Black respondents were victims of the excessive use of police as well, of force as well by the police. So what is the purpose of our study on multi-ethnic Canadians? Well, The purpose of this project is to explore how the experiences of multi-ethnic Canadians with their state might differ from other racialized groups who have lived in Canada generation over generation. And why do we believe that certain racialized groups might experience discrimination or systemic racism differently than others? Well, through a process of developing an identity in the heterogeneous binaries of being British or French Canadian, multi ethnic Canadians reconcile their ancestral identities with predominant notions of Canadianism. Some ethnic and immigrant groups are more likely than other racialized communities to experience a high degree of cooperation and integration with the state's institutions and practices. And this can be for a number of reasons. One reason could be their level of institutional completeness within their ethnic group. And so, what this basically means is that individuals or communities or groups of people who have a high degree of institutional completeness are more likely not to deviate from their ethnic group and seek out an identity in another ethnic group. What they may do, what is likely to happen with individuals who are high on the institutional completeness scale is that they're likely to stay within the confines of their ethnic group and not develop an identity outside of that. On the other hand, there are some multi-ethnic groups and communities who rank low on institutional completeness, and they are less likely to continue living out of their ethnic enclave in Canada, and therefore more likely to seek an identity with more predominant notions of identity plaguing the state. And so it is the groups of individuals with low institutional completeness we suspect may experience the state differently relative to other racialized groups. And so now I'm going to hand it over to my supervisor, Dr. Natalie Delia Deckard, to explain a little bit about the data.
Hi, everyone. Dara, thank you so much for that amazing lit review and theoretical background to get us into this. We have this eternal problem in Canada, and I think it's particularly visible to me because I grew up in the United States, where every box is a box about your racial identity, right? We're really comfortable in some national context talking about race as identity, right? And the ways in which that racial identity at least predicts and perhaps defines your relationship to not only the state, but to the community around it. In Canada, in comparison or in contrast, conversations around racial identity are culturally discouraged. Right? The idea that your group belonging would work to predict your relationship to the larger national community is politically anathema. Anyone who is here from France, for example, will recognize this thought process. So Dara and I really struggled to be able to find data about the ways in which multi-ethnic Canadians understand their community, understand their political reality, and indeed understand themselves in this space. We were able to access data from the Provincial Diversity Project, which was a survey that compared public opinions, right, about the way that things were going, what needs to happen in Canada, and marked for each individual respondent their ethnic identity. And what's important here, that one of the ethnic identities was white. Right? So we're able to see who identifies as white and who identifies as white and something else, right? Because you had respondents had the capacity to choose more than one identity. I won't go through all the nitty gritty in the last 2 minutes of the sampling procedures of the data, right? But the data are quite robust, right? And we were pleased with it. Eric, if you could give me the next slide. I present preliminary analysis, right, for people to have a good time with, right? This is respondents' political views, right? Essentially, it's the ways in which they view what the next steps for the Canadian political community might be. I'm going to let you guys just take a look at these correlations quickly. I want to contrast the ways that respondents who identified as white answered compared to the way that respondents who identified as non-white answered. And then, right, this group of people that we can understand as perhaps half white, half non-white. Now, there are going to be people in here for whom that's not as clear, but right, these are our white multi-ethnics, right, Canadian multi-ethnics. So interestingly, as we look through, and this is fairly consistent, though I use these particular questions for their utility in this conference presentation, it's pretty consistent. For white multi-ethnics, when identity is significantly associated with response, are answering in ways that resemble respondents who identify as white, rather than responding in a way, right, that resembles respondents who identify as non-white. Okay? What does that mean? Right? How do we understand that white multi-ethnics are also identifying as visible minorities? So they walk in the world and they walk in the community as non-white people. They're presenting as non-white, but they're largely espousing the political positions of respondents who are not visible minorities and of respondents who identify as white. Dara, if you give me the next slide. How does this nuance our understanding, right, of the ways that ethnic identity and that racialization influences your perceptions of discrimination, of political leanings, right, and of your place in the larger community? And that's where we'll leave it today after the 10 minutes. Thanks for your attention, everyone.
Thanks, Natalie and Dara. I appreciate it. It looks like you've already unshared your screen, and we're going to invite the next panel up. And I believe it's Madeline said that she's going to be taking this. So, Madeline, stage is yours.
Thank you. Oh, it's loading. Can everyone see my screen?
Yes.
All right, great. So my name is Madeline Uretsky. I am a master's degree candidate in criminal justice at Boston University and the senior research assistant at the Boston University School of Medicine Chronic Traumatic Encephalopathy Center, here with my advisors from the CJ program, Dr. Shea Cronin and Dr. Danielle Rousseau. The title of our project is Assessing the Relationships Between CTE, Trauma, and Aggression in an Autopsy Cohort of Former Athletes. And this is just a content warning that I will be talking about suicide and showing pictures of real human brains, which may be disturbing to some people. So what is CTE? We often hear this word in the media, and it's pretty much synonymous now with Aaron Hernandez, the former Florida Gator and New England Patriots football star who was convicted of murder and then died by suicide in his prison cell. His brain was subsequently donated to our lab and examined and found to have one of the worst cases of chronic traumatic encephalopathy, or CTE, which is a progressive brain disease that's irreversible and caused by many hits to the head over time. And it was one of the worst cases that my PI and leader of the lab, Dr. Ann McKee, had ever seen. And what we think is that this narrative that aggression has been and violence have been associated with this disease and in football players in general, just from the media reports and what people have been saying over the last 5 to 10 years and all about the concussion crisis. But this really hasn't been studied in depth until now. There haven't been any studies looking at aggregates of aggression symptoms, just kind of more on a binary basis, whether they were aggressive or not, but in smaller sample sizes. So we wanted to look at, we know that head trauma causes CTE, but we wanted to know if aggression was actually associated with the disease, and then what also might be driving that aggressive behavior in this population, whether it's trauma or maybe something else. But we did predict that the reports by the families who donate their brains, that they would say that their loved one had aggressive behaviors if they had CTE, as well as potentially an exposure to a trauma in childhood. And so this is a very unique data source. This is the first time this data has ever been presented at any sort of criminology setting, conference. This is completely new to the criminology world, and this is my first time ever at a criminology conference, so I'm very happy to be here, and of course thankful to all of the organizers. But this, as a data source, it's been published over the last 5 to 10 years, over 200 papers using this sample, Dr. McKee again being our leader in the lab. And the sample itself over the last 10 to 12 years has collected over 989 total brains since 2008. We're at 164 as of last week, and the trend is going up every year, and in particular, the variety of cases that we're getting. And so we're actually seeing 70% of our sample is football players, like, most people assume with the disease it's a football disease, but 30% of our sample is a variety of other athletes and military veterans. And 1 in 5 are under the age of 40, and about 2% are female. And so how our study works is once a brain is received at the lab, it goes through 2 parallel pathways of research. One is the pathology protocol. They're in the lab, blinded to all the clinical information, so they don't know what they're looking at. They do a full examination of the brain, including for tumors, strokes, Alzheimer's disease, any sort of pathology that could be there. And then on the other side is the clinical side, which I'm a big part of. We do the psychological autopsy method, which is a retrospective analysis of clinical information from the family members. So they do 2 surveys as well as a phone interview with a doctor and a research assistant. And I'm one of those research assistants that conducts these interviews. And then we have a interdisciplinary diagnostic conference where we come together and discuss the findings, and then the families get the results. And so these families have all generously donated their loved ones' brains and have gone public in either their decision to donate or their diagnosis. Some of the main ones here, of course, these aren't football players. They're part of that 30%, Chris Benoit, the wrestler, being one of them, as well as hockey players, Bob Probert, Stan Mikita, and Derek Bugard. But our sample that we're presenting here today is 575 individuals, fairly homogenous, being mostly white male football players, but significantly the age of death is about 60 years old, and the average age of death in the US is 78. So these are fairly, much younger people, and there were only 15 women in the sample. And so we measured aggression using the Brown-Goodwin assessment for lifetime history of aggression. This is a frequently used validated measure of aggression in carceral settings in particular. There haven't really been many studies in autopsy cohorts of aggression and brain disease in general. And so this is really one of those first as well. And we use the adult Brown-Goodwin score. There, it is measured at 3 different time points: childhood, adolescent, and adulthood. There are 12 questions, and it's a 4-point scale. So the total score is 48, but we just looked at the adult score here, and the average was about 20. And we did a factor analysis and found 4 different types of aggression that came out: emotional dysregulation and impulsivity, antisocial behavior, physical manifestations of anger, and interpersonal relations. And so this Brown-Goodwin score is going to be our major outcome. And we measured CTE in 3 different ways: the binary presence or absence of 1 or more lesions, which is the top picture; the doctor's severity rating, so how bad is it in the frontal lobe in particular, which is the area first affected in CTE, and an area that has been researched for decades, knowing that it is involved in aggressive behaviors, as well as a computer-generated model of the disease where we scan their slides in, and it counts the amount of positive pixels that have the disease in it. And so we have these 3 different models that we're looking at, and the presence of CTE in this sample, 65.9% did have the disease. And then we measured trauma as part of our psychological autopsy method. This was this question from the primary care post-traumatic stress disorder from DSM-5, this PC-PTSD scale. This question was asked during the interview with the research assistant, and if they answered yes to it, we checked off that they had a traumatic event. We also asked about the different types of trauma, and that's a future line of work that we're going to look into as well. But this sample itself, 35% were exposed to at least 1 traumatic event. And so for our results, we surprisingly found, using 3 different ordinary least squares regression models, we found that the presence of CTE, or the severity of it, measured in the 3 different ways, was not significantly associated with aggression, and it was not elevated. The scores were not elevated in this group here, but what we did find was that the presence of having experienced 1 or more traumatic events was associated with increased aggression scores. You can see with the middle at 0, that's the null, and so above the null is significant. And so we think that the trauma is really driving these aggressive behaviors, and all of the models controlled for sex, race, age at death, education, whether they died by suicide, whether they were in the military, other pathologies associated with aggression, the trauma, and then their childhood aggression scores from the Brown-Goodwin. And so we think what this means is CTE is a post-mortem brain disease diagnosis right now. And so we are really trying to identify in vivo targets for diagnosis and accurate prediction of these clinical behaviors. And we don't think now that aggression is necessarily accurately predicting whether someone will have the pathology or not. But what we do see is that trauma is associated with the aggressive behaviors more so than that pathology. And so trauma might actually be a really important point for intervention and identification in this group of former athletes, military veterans who are exposed to these concussions and repetitive head trauma over time. And so we think that it's really good to note that they might have experienced trauma, to identify that, and it's something that can be helped. And we're not discounting anyone's experiences. People definitely have aggressive behaviors, but as a whole, in this sample in aggregate, it might not necessarily be the most important factor. And so these are the funders, mainly the National Institutes of Health. I'd like to thank everyone in the lab, particularly Dr. McKee, and for all of Dr. Cronin and Dr. Rousseau's help and guidance.
Thank you, Madeline. That was incredible. That was awesome. Let me just stop my timer here. Before I move on, there's supposed to be a third presentation here from an Angelo Brown. Has Angelo joined us? Is Angelo in the attendees by any chance? I just want to make sure I don't, have somebody in the wrong box here. I want to make sure that they have time. I'd like to just give the attendees a question, or give the attendees an opportunity to write any questions that they might have to our panelists. There is a Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. But I guess, Mike, if I can ask a question, I'd like to ask Madeline a question here. If there is a way to diagnose CTE pre somebody dying and you actually looking at their brain, is there anything that physically we can do for these individuals, or is it all about like getting them therapy or support or something environmental that can help them?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the first step in any sort of disease treatment is being able to accurately diagnose it when someone is alive. And then at that point, you can figure out what are the therapeutic targets, whether it's the protein clearance in the brain, so you can develop a drug potentially to clear that protein away, or whether it's treating the symptoms, at least at the beginning before that drug treatment is available, treating the symptoms, like I mentioned before, potentially therapy with the trauma. A lot of the clinical symptoms we've heard and reported are depression, anxiety, a lot of psychological symptoms, as well as cognitive symptoms. So going to a neuropsychologist and having strategies, for you that are specific to your cognitive deficits.
And if I could ask a clarifying question as well, because a lot of this research that I've read over the last few years is, one of the biggest reasons why my wife and I won't let our son play football ever. When we're talking about athletes, particularly in this context, you're talking about athletes that have some sort of contact sport, right? We're not talking about a cross-country runner or a golfer or something like that. We're talking about somebody that's like a wrestler or a football player or something.
Boxing. Yeah, it's
boxing. Okay, yeah, that's a good one. Yeah,
it's all about the repetitive head trauma over time, and so you're not going to get this disease from 1 concussion, 10 concussions. We're really trying to understand what is that threshold of hits that you can sustain, particularly at a young age when people are starting to play football, 5, 6, 8 years old, and then what that might mean for the developing brain. And so it really is all about the cumulative hits over time that is driving the disease.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Are there any other questions from the audience, or are there any questions that panelists would like to ask of one another? Is there anything else people would like to share? We have a little bit of time left, but if not, we can. I don't think Angelo is here, unfortunately. Okay, so I'd just like to thank everybody for attending. This has been a great day so far, and I've gotten to see a lot of great research from a lot of different people that I've never had the opportunity to see before. So I really appreciate you joining us. And I'd say that the videos for this will be up on YouTube, I believe, by the end of the year. Though, with holidays, we got to process all this stuff and then put it up online. You'll get an email about that, I assume. Just one housekeeping thing. I am going to be hosting the next session on this screen at 2:00. But once I end this, everybody's getting kicked out of Zoom, out of this Zoom session, and I'll be back for the panelists at about 1:50, 1:55, and then we'll start broadcasting again at 2 to everyone else. So thank you to everyone. Thank you. And I hope everybody stays safe and healthy, and I will see you soon. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.